They said marrying into the Grey Empire was an honor. What they didn't tell me was that I'd be standing between two brothers, both powerful, both dangerous, both intent on claiming me in different ways. Adrian Grey, the eldest, was my fiancé. The cold air. The kind of man who could crush a boardroom with a single glance. He treated me like a contract, like I was just another asset to secure the empire. But then there was Julian. His younger brother. Warm, charming, reckless in all the ways Adrian wasn't. He smiled too easily, touched too casually, and whispered things that made me feel alive again in a world where I was supposed to stand still and play the perfect bride. At the first gala, I tried to follow the rules, stay poised, stay silent, stay at Adrian's side even if he never looked at me once. Hours passed before Julian appeared at my elbow, his grin boyish and dangerous all at once as he slid a glass of champagne into my hand. "Careful," he murmured, eyes glinting. "If you keep standing so still, someone might think my brother doesn't know what he's got." I shouldn't have laughed. But I did. Because in that moment, Julian felt like the better choice. Safer. Easier. Sweeter. And maybe, if my life had been different, he would have been. But then I stepped back into the ballroom, and froze. Across the crowd of glittering gowns and sharp smiles, Adrian Grey was watching me. Not with indifference. Not with boredom. His gaze was locked, sharp as steel, burning through the space between us. The golden brother was close enough to touch. But the cold air, the man who swore he didn't care, was staring at me like I already belonged to him. The weight of that stare pinned me in place, more suffocating than the chandelier light blazing above or the dozens of conversations buzzing around the ballroom. Adrian Grey did not look at people. He assessed, he measured, he dismissed. And yet his eyes were on me, sharp and unyielding, as if Julian's laughter at my side was something he couldn't ignore. My fingers tightened around the glass of champagne Julian had pressed into my hand, and I forced myself to keep breathing, to keep moving, to play the part of the composed fiancé I had been forced to become. But inside my chest, my heart raced like it wanted to escape. Julian leaned closer, his breath brushing my ear as he asked some light-hearted question I didn't hear, because all I could feel was the tension stretched like wire across the room. When I finally tore my gaze away from Adrian, it was only because Julian touched my wrist, leading me toward the balcony again as though he wanted to rescue me from my silence. He was easy to talk to, too easy. He asked about my family, my studies, things Adrian had never once bothered to mention. He laughed at my answers, making me feel like I belonged somewhere, even if only in his orbit. For a fleeting moment I let myself believe that maybe this was the brother I should have been promised to, the one who could make me feel human instead of ornamental. But even as I smiled at Julian's charm, my mind betrayed me with the memory of Adrian's eyes. Later, when I returned inside, Adrian was gone from sight, replaced by a sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns. I found him only when I was summoned to his side by an aide who whispered that my presence was required. There he was, standing with investors, his expression perfectly carved from marble, as though he hadn't been watching me minutes earlier with something that looked dangerously close to possession. He didn't acknowledge me when I stepped into place beside him. Not a nod, not a glance, not even the brush of a hand. But when one of the men at the table joked about how quickly young women adjusted to life at this level, I felt Adrian's hand rest on the back of my chair, steady, firm, a silent claim no one else would notice but me. He didn't look at me, didn't say a word, but the message was clear. He heard everything. And it mattered. The rest of the night passed in a blur of clinking glasses and whispered gossip, but the longer I stayed by his side, the more I wondered which version of Adrian Grey was real, the statue carved of ice, or the man whose eyes had burned holes into me across the room. When the gala ended, Julian offered to escort me to the car, his smile lingering as he bowed slightly, always the perfect gentleman in front of others. But before I could answer, Adrian was there, his hand closing around mine with no explanation, guiding me forward with such certainty that Julian's smile froze, faltered, and then vanished altogether. The car door shut behind us, and the silence inside was deafening. I turned to him, waiting for something, anything, but he only stared straight ahead, the city lights flashing across his profile. Finally, I whispered, "Why did you look at me like that?" The question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. His jaw tightened, but he didn't turn his head. "Don't imagine things," he said flatly, as if that moment on the balcony had never happened. But when his hand tightened almost imperceptibly around mine, refusing to let go until the car pulled into the penthouse gates, I realized it wasn't my imagination at all. Adrian Gray was breaking his own rules. And I didn't know whether it would save me, or ruin me. The penthouse was silent when we arrived, the kind of silence that magnified every sound, the click of my heels on the marble floor, the quiet thud as Adrian set his phone on the glass table, the low hum of the city far below. He hadn't spoken since the car, and the longer he stayed silent, the heavier the air grew between us. I wanted to demand answers, to force him to explain why he had looked at me like that, why his grip had lingered on mine even as his words told me it meant nothing. But Adrian Gray was a man who thrived on silence, who wielded it like a blade sharper than anything he could say. So I walked toward my room, pretending his presence didn't unravel me, pretending I didn't feel the weight of his eyes following me until the door shut behind me. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between the warmth of Julian's easy charm and the cold intensity that Adrian tried so hard to deny. One made me feel safe, wanted, seen. The other made me feel as though the ground could crumble beneath me at any second, and that I might let it. The next morning, the world around us returned to business. Adrian was already in the dining room when I came down, dressed in a dark suit, reading over documents with the same ruthless focus that made him untouchable. He didn't greet me, didn't acknowledge me, just turned a page as if I weren't there. But when I sat down, I found a cup of coffee already waiting for me, made exactly the way I liked it, down to the hint of cream and the single spoon of sugar I hadn't told anyone about. I looked up, startled, but he was already moving to leave, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, but something inside me shifted anyway. Later that week, another event forced us back into the spotlight. It was a luncheon at the Gray estate, a polished affair meant to impress investors and remind the world of their dominance. Julian, as always, was the first to break the ice. He swept me into conversation with ease, laughing at my remarks, making the others smile. He was sunshine in a world built on shadows, and everyone adored him for it. Even I found myself laughing, forgetting for a moment that my life was bound to Adrian, not Julian. But then I felt it, that prickle at the back of my neck, the unmistakable weight of Adrian's gaze. He was across the room, speaking with two executives, but his eyes flicked to me, lingering just long enough to set my pulse racing. He didn't interrupt, didn't make a scene. He simply watched, silent and unyielding, until Julian leaned in too close and his smile faltered. Later, when the luncheon ended and the crowd dispersed, I walked with Julian toward the gardens, grateful for the fresh air. His tone grew softer when we were alone, his charm shifting into something more dangerous. "You know," he said lightly, "you don't have to play the dutiful fiancé forever. My brother doesn't deserve someone like you." His words made my chest tighten. For a moment I wondered what it would be like if things were different, if I had been promised to Julian instead. He was kind, he was attentive, and he didn't hide behind walls of ice. But before I could answer, footsteps sounded on the gravel path. Adrian was there, his shadow stretching across the garden. He didn't speak at first, just looked between us with an expression so sharp it made Julian smirk. "Relax, Adrian," Julian drawled. I was only keeping her company. Adrian's jaw tightened, his gaze cutting into me before landing on his brother. "You've done enough," he said, his tone low, lethal. Julian chuckled, as if amused, but when he left, his grin carried something smug that unsettled me. The silence that followed was heavier than the humid air. I swallowed, turning toward Adrian, but he was already moving past me, his shoulders rigid, his stride controlled. "You don't have to save me from him," I said, my voice cracking. He stopped, his back to me, and for a moment I thought he would keep walking. Then, without turning, he said, "I'm not saving you from him. I'm saving you from yourself." The words struck harder than they should have, leaving me frozen among the roses. Because I didn't know if he meant I couldn't trust Julian, or if he meant I couldn't trust myself with the way Adrian Gray was starting to matter. The drive back from the estate was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence I had come to expect from Adrian Gray. This silence pulsed, thick with words left unsaid, his profile carved sharp against the glow of the city lights streaming through the window. I sat with my hands clasped in my lap, replaying his words in the garden over and over. "I'm saving you from yourself." He hadn't looked at me when he said it, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Was it a warning, a judgment, or something else entirely? When the car slowed in front of the penthouse, he finally spoke, his voice low, measured, but laced with something I couldn't place. "Julian likes to play games. Don't let him use you to win one." I turned to him, searching his face for answers, but he didn't meet my eyes. He stepped out first, his hand brushing mine briefly as he guided me from the car. It was nothing, barely contact at all. And yet it left my pulse racing the entire way up the elevator. That night I lay in bed sleepless again, torn between two brothers who couldn't be more different. Julian made me feel wanted, alive, like I wasn't just a pawn in a larger plan. But Adrian unsettled me. He never gave me softness, never spoke to me like Julian did. And still, he made me feel more with a single glance than Julian ever could with 100 words. The next morning I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, a newspaper folded neatly on the counter. He didn't acknowledge me at first, but when I reached for the coffee pot, I realized there was already a cup waiting, prepared the exact way I drank it. I froze, staring at it. "I didn't tell anyone how I take my coffee," I said softly. Adrian glanced at me then, his eyes unreadable. "You don't have to." He picked up his jacket and left without another word, leaving me stunned in the empty kitchen, staring at the steam rising from the cup he hadn't admitted to making. Later that week came another gala, this one louder, brighter, more ruthless than the last. The air hummed with ambition, every guest hungry for something, status, power, secrets. I stood at Adrian's side as usual, silent and smiling, but as the evening wore on, Julian appeared at my elbow, his charm effortless. "You look miserable," he teased, offering me a drink. "Come dance with me. No one's watching." I hesitated, but his grin was disarming, and for a moment I let him lead me to the floor. He spun me easily, laughing, and for a brief second I felt light, free. Until the crowd parted, and I saw Adrian across the room. He was speaking with an investor, but his eyes were on us, locked, unblinking. The intensity of his stare made my breath catch. Julian leaned in, his lips brushing dangerously close to my ear. "You deserve someone who actually looks at you." My chest tightened, but before I could reply, Julian's hand tightened on my waist, pulling me closer. And that was when Adrian moved. He cut across the floor like a storm, the conversation he had been in abandoned mid-sentence. In seconds he was beside us, his hand closing firmly around mine. His gaze burned into his brother's, but his voice was controlled, every word precise. "I'll take it from here." The tension between them crackled, sharp enough to slice the air. Julian smirked, his eyes glittering with something more than amusement, but he let me go, stepping back with a mocking bow. Adrian didn't give me time to speak, didn't give me time to breathe. He pulled me away from the floor, his grip unyielding until we were outside on the terrace. Only then did he stop, his chest rising and falling as though he'd been holding his breath. I looked at him, my voice shaking. "Why does it matter to you?" His eyes finally met mine, and for once there was no mask, no calculated distance, just fire. "Because he's not the one who gets to touch you." The words hung between us like a spark in dry air, dangerous and impossible to ignore. My breath caught, my pulse racing as the city lights glittered behind Adrian Gray, casting him in shadow and steel. He didn't move, didn't waver, but his jaw was tight, his hand still wrapped firmly around mine as if daring me to deny him. "Adrian," I whispered, but the name felt foreign on my tongue, heavy with everything I couldn't say. His eyes stayed locked on mine, sharp and unrelenting, until finally he released me, stepping back as though he'd just realized what he had done. The cold mask slipped over his face again, and with it the distance I hated more than anything. "Go inside," he said flatly, his tone leaving no room for argument. I wanted to scream at him, demand answers, but his walls were already back in place, higher than ever. So I obeyed, walking past him into the golden light of the ballroom, but every nerve in my body burned from the memory of his voice when he claimed me as though I were already his. The rest of the night blurred, and by the time we returned to the penthouse, Adrian was silent, his gaze fixed out the car window as though the city itself was easier to look at than me. Julian's smirk lingered in my memory, the gleam of victory in his eyes even when Adrian had pulled me away. I knew this wasn't over, not between them, and not between us. Days passed, but the tension didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. Every time I entered a room, I felt Adrian's presence before I saw him, the weight of his gaze like a tether I couldn't escape. He didn't touch me again, didn't repeat those words, but the silence between us was louder than any declaration. One evening, as we prepared for yet another dinner with the board, Julian appeared at my door, dressed impeccably as always, his grin lazy and charming. "You look beautiful," he said without hesitation, his eyes sweeping over me with an ease that should have been flattering but instead felt too practiced. "My brother doesn't deserve you." He offered his arm, bold as ever. "Come with me tonight. Let them all see what they're missing." My chest tightened, torn between the safety of Julian's easy warmth and the jagged pull of Adrian's cold restraint. But before I could answer, Adrian's voice cut through the hall. "She won't need your escort." He stood at the end of the corridor, his expression unreadable, but his presence filled every inch of the space. Julian's grin widened, defiant, but he dropped his arm and stepped aside with mock civility. Adrian didn't look at him again. His eyes were on me, steady and sharp, as he extended his hand. For a long moment I didn't move, caught in the web of his control. Then, against every rational thought, I placed my hand in his. His fingers curled around mine with quiet finality, and as he led me forward, I felt the truth settle in my bones. Julian might have been the light, the warmth, the easy choice. But it was Adrian Gray whose shadows I was already lost in. The boardroom dinner was as suffocating as I expected, a parade of powerful men with smiles sharpened into weapons and women draped in jewels whispering behind their hands. I had learned quickly that in this world, no one wasted a word unless it was calculated, no one wasted a glance unless it was meant to wound. I sat at Adrian Gray's side, the perfect fiancé, my smile fixed in place even as whispers drifted across the table about how long I would last, how soon Victoria, the woman who had once been seen at Adrian's side, would reclaim her position. Julian was across the room, charming a group of guests with effortless laughter, and every time his eyes flicked toward me I felt the weight of the choice pressing in on me. He made it so easy to believe there could be something light in all this darkness, that not every part of my life had to be dictated by contracts and alliances. But then Adrian's hand brushed against mine under the table, subtle and deliberate, and the air left my lungs. He didn't look at me, didn't change his expression or break his conversation with the man beside him, but the silent pressure of his fingers against mine told me more than words ever could. I tried to focus on the speeches, on the endless toasts to prosperity and power, but my thoughts kept circling back to the heat of his skin against mine, the memory of his voice on the terrace when he said Julian wasn't the one who got to touch me. When the evening ended, Adrian stood smoothly, his chair sliding back with the kind of authority that made the room hush for half a breath. He didn't look at Julian, didn't acknowledge the way his brother lingered near the door, but when he placed his hand at the small of my back to guide me out, it was a gesture no one could mistake for indifference. The car ride was quiet, as always, but this silence was different. It pulsed, charged with everything left unsaid. I wanted to break it, to ask him why he kept drawing these invisible lines only to cross them, why he let me believe he didn't care only to prove otherwise in the next breath. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I stared at him in the glow of the passing streetlights, memorizing the sharp edges of his profile, the way his hands rested tightly on his lap as though even they were under his control. When we reached the penthouse, I expected him to retreat to his office like always, to bury himself in numbers and strategies until the early hours of the morning. Instead, he paused in the foyer, his eyes flicking to me as I slipped off my coat. "Don't listen to them," he said suddenly, his voice low but steady. I froze, turning to him. "What?" His gaze held mine, unflinching. "The whispers. The comparisons. They don't matter." His words were a command, not comfort, but beneath the steel there was something else, something raw that shook me. I nodded slowly, my throat tight, and he turned away, retreating into the shadows of his study before I could ask what it meant. That night, I dreamt of both brothers, Julian's laughter, his warmth, his easy promises, and Adrian's eyes, cold but burning, hands that claimed me in silence. And when I woke, I hated myself for knowing which one had truly reached me. The days blurred with more appearances, more whispers, more battles I didn't fully understand. The empire was shifting beneath Adrian's feet, challenged by rivals who scented weakness, but he never faltered in public. He stood taller, colder, untouchable. Yet behind closed doors, I caught him unraveling. Once, late at night, I passed his office and saw him sitting in the dark, his head in his hands. He didn't notice me, and I didn't interrupt, but the image seared itself into me, the cold air cracking in the shadows where no one else could see. I couldn't stop wondering what it meant that he let me catch even that much. Julian noticed too, though not in the same way. He sought me out more often, his smiles tinged with something sharper, his compliments heavier. One afternoon, when Adrian had left for a meeting, Julian cornered me in the library, leaning casually against the shelves with a glass of scotch in hand. "You don't have to chain yourself to him, you know," he said, his tone light but his eyes too serious. "My brother doesn't know how to care for anyone. He'll use you until you're convenient, and then he'll discard you like he's done with everything else." His words made my chest tighten, but before I could answer, the door opened. Adrian stood there, framed by the glow of the hall, his expression like carved stone. For a moment no one moved, the tension stretching taut, and then Julian smirked, setting down his glass as he brushed past him. "See you at dinner, brother." Adrian's eyes stayed on me long after Julian left, the weight of his gaze pressing against my skin until I couldn't breathe. He didn't speak, didn't demand an explanation, but when he finally stepped inside and closed the door, the sound echoed like a vow. "Don't listen to him either," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of something I had never heard before. "I'm not my brother." The words lodged in my chest, deeper than any promise Julian had ever made, because for once Adrian Gray wasn't guarding himself. He was letting me see him, even if only for a fleeting moment. And it was that glimpse, not Julian's warmth, that I carried with me long into the night. The next few days were heavier than any before. The empire was under constant fire, lawsuits, whispers of betrayal within the board, reporters circling like vultures hungry for the first sign of collapse. Adrian Gray moved through it all like a man forged from stone, his expression never wavering in public, his composure flawless, his words sharp enough to cut down any challenger. And yet I had seen him in the dark, with his head in his hands, his armor cracking where no one else could see. It was a truth I couldn't unsee, no matter how hard he tried to pretend it wasn't there. Julian, of course, thrived in the chaos. He smiled, charmed, and laughed as though nothing could touch him, as though his brother's empire unraveling was entertainment. He lingered at my side more often, too close, too eager, whispering reminders that I didn't have to stay chained to Adrian. At another gala, he caught me in the middle of the dance floor, spinning me with a grin that made the crowd cheer. "You look better with me," he teased, his voice low but loud enough for those nearby to hear. My chest tightened, not from his words, but from the familiar prickle of Adrian's gaze across the room. He stood by the bar, a glass in his hand, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked on mine. Every turn of Julian's hand, every laugh that slipped from my lips under the pressure of eyes watching us, made Adrian's jaw tighten. The moment the music stopped, he was there. He didn't say a word, didn't ask permission. He simply stepped between us and took my hand, his stare at Julian sharp enough to slice. The room hushed as he guided me away, his grip firm, his silence louder than any declaration. Out on the terrace, under the glow of city lights, I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding. "You can't keep doing this," I whispered, though my voice trembled. "Dragging me away every time your brother so much as looks at me." Adrian's gaze cut through me, fierce and unrelenting. "You think this is about him?" His voice was low, rough, stripped of its usual control. "It's about you." My breath caught, my chest tightening painfully. "Then say it," I demanded, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Say what I am to you, Adrian." For a long moment he didn't answer. The city roared beneath us, horns blaring, laughter spilling from the ballroom, but all I could hear was the silence stretching between us. His eyes burned into mine, his jaw working as if he were fighting himself. Finally, his voice broke the quiet and raw. "You're the only thing I can't afford to lose." The words sliced through me, leaving me shaken. Before I could speak, he stepped back, his mask snapping back into place, but it was too late. He had let me see too much. When we returned inside, Julian's smirk told me he had noticed everything. He leaned in as I passed, his whisper brushing my ear. "Careful. My brother only plays for keeps." I didn't respond, but the warning lodged in my chest. That night, long after the guests had left and the lights had dimmed, I found Adrian on the balcony, staring out at the skyline like it might give him answers. For a moment I simply watched him, the way the moonlight caught in his hair, the rigid set of his shoulders. Then I stepped closer, close enough for the night air between us to tremble. He didn't turn, didn't speak, but when I rested my hand lightly against his arm, he didn't pull away. His silence was still a wall, but it was a wall beginning to crack. And I realized, with terrifying clarity, that while I had been falling all along, Adrian Gray was falling too, and when he finally let go, it wouldn't be careful. It would be catastrophic. The fracture lines in Adrian Gray's control widened with every passing day. I saw it in the way he gripped the edge of a table during meetings, in the sharpness of his words when a board member questioned his strategy, in the restless tension that clung to him like a shadow long after the conversations ended. Outwardly, he was still the cold air, the unshakable leader, but I knew better now. I had seen the way his eyes lingered too long, the way his silence cracked around me, the way his touch, when it came, was less about performance and more about need. And it was that knowledge that made Julian's presence all the more suffocating. He appeared at every corner, offering easy smiles and whispered promises, reminding me of what life could look like if I chose the brother who laughed instead of the one who brooded. At another investor gathering, Julian found me by the bar, his charm as relentless as ever. "You know," he said, tilting his glass toward me with a sly grin, "you'd be happier with me. You wouldn't have to stand here alone while my brother pretends you're invisible." I forced a polite smile, but my chest tightened. Before I could respond, Adrian arrived at my side, silent as a storm, his hand resting on the small of my back with quiet possession. Julian's grin widened, unbothered. "See? Even now he can't let me have a moment with you." His words were teasing, but the challenge in his eyes was sharp. Adrian's gaze flicked to him, icy and lethal. "Walk away, Julian." His brother chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender, but the damage was done. The guests nearby had noticed, their whispers buzzing like hornets, their eyes darting between the three of us. I hated the way they looked at me, like I was a prize being fought over. When Julian finally drifted off, Adrian guided me away from the crowd, his touch firm, his silence loud. I pulled free when we reached the hallway, my voice breaking as I turned to him. "Why do you let it happen?" His brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing. "What?" "Him," I said, anger spilling through me. "He keeps circling, keeps whispering, and you," my throat tightened. "You only ever say something when it's too late. You act like it doesn't matter, but then you look at me like it does. Which is it, Adrian? Do I matter to you or not?" His eyes darkened, his jaw tight, and for a moment I thought he would retreat again, that he would leave me standing there with nothing but questions. But then he stepped closer, so close I had to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. You matter more than you should, he said quietly, his voice raw, almost broken. And that terrifies me. My heart stuttered, the air rushing out of my lungs. For the first time, he wasn't hiding, wasn't pretending. He was telling me the truth, and it shook me to my core. I wanted to ask more, to demand what it meant, but footsteps echoed down the hall, breaking the moment apart. A group of investors rounded the corner, and just like that, Adrian's mask slid back into place. He turned, his hand brushing mine once, fleeting and desperate, before he stepped away as though nothing had happened. That night, I found him in the library, staring at the fire with a drink in his hand. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge me until I sat across from him. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until I whispered, "Why do you keep pulling me close if you're just going to push me away?" His gaze finally lifted, and the vulnerability there nearly undid me. "Because once I start, I won't be able to stop," he said simply. His honesty was a blade, sharp and unrelenting. My chest ached, torn between wanting to run and wanting to fall further. I realized then that Julian might have been the better choice on paper, warm, charming, safe, but he was nothing compared to the storm that was Adrian Gray. Because when Adrian finally let himself fall, I knew it wouldn't be safe at all. It would be ruinous. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to survive it, or be consumed by it. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. The Gray Empire was teetering on the edge, rumors of betrayal within the board spreading like wildfire, and rivals circling with offers designed to cut the family apart. Adrian Gray bore it all with his usual composure in public, but behind closed doors I could see the cracks widening. He worked late into the night, his tie discarded, his jacket draped over a chair, his hair falling carelessly across his forehead. I'd pass by his office and hear his voice raised on the phone, not the cold, controlled tone the world knew but something harsher, angrier, rawer. One night, I found him sitting alone in the library with a half-empty glass in his hand, the firelight painting his face in shadows. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't speak until I sank into the chair opposite him. "You should stay away from me," he said, his voice low, tired. I swallowed hard. "Why?" His eyes lifted then, piercing and dark. "Because I don't know how to need someone without destroying them." My chest ached, but I didn't look away. "You're not destroying me." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Not yet." Silence stretched, thick and suffocating, but I didn't move. And then, almost against his will, he admitted, "When you stand next to Julian, I can't breathe. When you laugh at something he says, I want to break him. When he touches you, even for a second, I feel like I'm losing everything I've spent my life building. And I can't afford that weakness." His words left me trembling, my heart hammering, but before I could respond, he set his glass down sharply and stood, retreating toward the door as if the confession itself had cost him too much. I thought he would leave me there shattered, but just before he disappeared into the hall, he turned back, his eyes burning. "Don't doubt what you are to me. Not again." He was gone before I could move, before I could breathe, leaving me drowning in the weight of what he'd just revealed. The next day at the office, the whispers about the Empire grew louder. Board members questioned Adrian's judgment, and I could feel Julian's eyes on me during every meeting, his smirk sharp, as though he knew his brother was unraveling. That evening, at yet another event meant to calm investors, Julian cornered me when Adrian was pulled away. His charm was gone this time, replaced by something harder. "You don't actually think he'll choose you over all this, do you?" he asked, gesturing to the glittering room around us. "He'll never let himself love you. He doesn't know how." My throat tightened, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "And you do?" Julian's smile faltered for the first time, and before he could respond, Adrian appeared at my side. His hand slid to mine, his grip fierce, his voice ice. "She doesn't need you to explain me." The tension between them was thick enough to choke on, and for a moment I thought the room itself might shatter. Julian finally smirked, stepping back, but his parting words left a chill. "Careful, brother. When you fall, you'll fall hard enough to bring her down with you." Adrian's grip didn't loosen until we were in the car, the city lights blurring past us. He didn't speak, but his hand stayed locked with mine, his thumb brushing over my skin in a way that felt more like a vow than a gesture. I realized then that Julian had been right about one thing: Adrian Gray was falling. And when he did, he wasn't just going to bring me with him. He was going to burn the entire empire down to keep me. The empire's foundation shook harder than ever the following week. News outlets leaked stories of corruption, rivals pushed for blood, and whispers of betrayal within the board became too loud to ignore. The Gray name was under siege, and so was Adrian. Yet through all of it, he stood tall, his mask unbroken before the world. Only I knew how much he was fraying, because only I saw him at night, jaw tight, sleeves rolled, poring over documents until his eyes darkened with exhaustion. I tried to stay silent, to keep my distance, but silence had become unbearable. One night I found him in the study, his head bowed over scattered papers, his tie loosened, his glass untouched beside him. "You can't keep this up," I whispered. His head snapped up, his gaze sharp. "I don't have a choice." I stepped closer, my voice shaking. "You do. You don't have to carry it alone." His lips parted, but instead of answering, he pushed the papers aside and stood, his movements clipped and sharp. "You think I can lean on you? You think I can need you when every man in that boardroom is waiting for me to show a weakness they can exploit?" His voice cracked, and the sound broke me. I swallowed hard, forcing the words past the lump in my throat. "You already do." The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy and electric. He stared at me as though I had peeled him open with a knife, and for once he didn't look like the cold air, untouchable and controlled. He looked like a man caught between surrender and ruin. Slowly, he crossed the space between us, his eyes locked on mine. "Say it again," he demanded, his voice low, raw. My breath caught, but I didn't flinch. "You already do." His hand cupped my cheek before I could breathe, his thumb brushing against my skin like he wasn't sure if I was real. And then his mouth was on mine, not soft, not careful, but desperate, consuming, years of restraint snapping in an instant. His kiss wasn't practice or pretense. It was truth. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath ragged. "I warned you," he whispered. "Once I start, I won't stop." My chest heaved, my hands trembling against his shirt. "Then don't." The fire between us burned until we had no choice but to break apart, but even then, his hand stayed on me, grounding, claiming. That night changed everything. Adrian stopped pretending in private. He stopped pulling away when his feelings slipped through. He touched me more often, not out of performance but because he wanted to. He asked questions, listened to my answers, let me see pieces of him no one else had ever touched. And yet, the more he gave, the more dangerous it became, because Julian saw it too. At the next gala, Julian intercepted me when Adrian was across the room. His smile was sharp, his voice edged. "So it's true. You've melted the ice." I stiffened, but he leaned closer, his eyes glittering. "Careful. My brother doesn't do halves. If you're the reason he falls, he'll burn everything to keep you, including me." His words sent a chill through me, but before I could respond, Adrian appeared. He didn't speak, didn't argue. He simply took my hand, his grip firm, and pulled me into the crowd without a single glance at his brother. And as the whispers of the room swirled around us, I realized Julian was right about one thing. Adrian Gray had fallen. Hard. And if he had his way, there was no force in the world that would separate me from him now. The storm finally broke. The Gray Empire had been under siege for weeks, but that night it all came to a head. The boardroom was packed with investors and directors, their faces sharp with anticipation, their voices brimming with doubt. Reports of Adrian's recklessness, his obsession, his supposed weakness filled the air. I stood at his side, silent, every eye flicking to me as though I were the reason the empire was cracking. And in a way, I was, because Adrian Gray had stopped being the man who sacrificed everything for control. He had already chosen something else. Someone else. Julian was there too, his smile sharp, his words smooth as he painted a picture of himself as the better leader, the brother who would keep the empire safe. Adrian has grown careless, he told the room, his eyes flicking to me with deliberate cruelty. He's distracted. Vulnerable. That makes us all vulnerable. The words stung, but before anyone could respond, Adrian rose to his feet. The room hushed instantly, every head turning to him, every whisper silenced by the sheer force of his presence. He didn't speak with the icy distance they expected. His voice was steady, but raw, stripped of the usual mask. You're right. I've changed. I'm not the same man I was months ago. And you want to know why? His gaze swept the room, sharp as a blade, before it landed on me. Because I found something worth protecting. Worth more than money. More than power. More than this empire. The air left my lungs as his words echoed through the chamber. Gasps rippled across the room, whispers rising, but Adrian didn't falter. He stepped closer to me, his hand finding mine without hesitation. You can take my company. You can strip me of my title. But you will never take her from me. Not while I can still stand. The board erupted in shouts, some outraged, others stunned, but the declaration was made. The mask Adrian Gray had worn all his life was gone, shattered, and in its place stood a man who had chosen love over empire. Julian's face darkened, his charm gone, his eyes burning with betrayal. For the first time, he looked less like the golden brother and more like what he truly was, ambitious, reckless, desperate to win. He left the room without another word, but I knew this wasn't the end of his fight. When the chaos subsided, enough allies remained to keep Adrian in power, though scarred and shaken. As the room emptied, Adrian turned to me, his hand still wrapped around mine. His eyes burned, vulnerable but unyielding. I told you once that if I started, I wouldn't stop, he said softly. And I won't. Not for them. Not for anyone. I'm already too far gone. My chest ached as I looked at him, this man who had been nothing but walls and silence, now standing bare before me. I realized then that Julian had been the easy choice, the one who seemed like sunlight. But Adrian was the truth. Cold, ruthless, flawed, and mine. Later that night, in the quiet of the penthouse, Adrian pulled me into his arms by the window, the city spread out like a kingdom below us. His voice was raw, steady, unshakable. Let them take everything else. As long as I have you, I have enough. And in that moment I knew the empire might rise or fall, brothers might clash and wars might rage, but Adrian Gray had already fallen, and he had fallen harder than anyone.